A few weeks ago, a Russian minister looked into the camera and said, "We don't need fuel restrictions. Everything is stable." On June 1st, 2026, Vladimir Putin personally signed a decree that does exactly the opposite, and he did it without a word of explanation. Russia's refineries are running at their lowest level in 16 years, 6 major facilities offline, one the refinery in Syzran completely shut down. And the most powerful man in Russia is letting it happen because he just had to make an extremely uncomfortable choice. What that choice is, that's the question we're going to break down today. To understand why this decree matters, we need to step back from the map for a moment. Not the map of the front line. An older map. One that hasn't changed since the Cold War. Russia isn't simply a country with oil. Russia is an energy superpower. For decades, its geopolitical power rested on a single pillar, the ability to supply the world with fuel and to use that supply as leverage. Pipelines to Europe, tankers to Asia, contracts with India. When the West imposed sanctions, Russia found another buyer. When a buyer pushed down the price, Russia found another market. When the invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022, that pillar was Russia's strategic insurance policy. The calculation in the Kremlin went like this. Even if the war drags on, even if the West supplies weapons, as long as Russia can export oil, the machine keeps running. The soldiers stay paid, industry stays supplied, the home front stays calm. And for over 4 years, that plan actually worked better than the West expected. Sanctions were imposed, a price cap was introduced, and yet Russia's oil revenues climbed again in early 2026 because global oil prices were high. At that point, many observers would have said Russia survives every wave. The fortress holds. But the fortress wasn't being besieged from the outside. It was being hollowed out from the inside. While everyone stared at oil prices, something else was happening, something the energy economists would only fully appreciate later. Russia doesn't sell crude oil directly to its citizens or to its own army. Russia processes that crude first in refineries' massive complex facilities that turn raw oil into gasoline, diesel, and kerosene. These refineries are not the fortress's strength. They are its bottleneck, its most vulnerable link, and that's exactly where Kyiv struck. Not with one spectacular blow, with a patient, almost invisible campaign, month after month, drone after drone, not at tanks, not at bunkers, at smokestacks, at storage tanks, at pump stations. The logic is brutally simple. When you destroy a refinery, you don't just lose one day of production. You lose months, sometimes years, because modern refineries are built from specialized components, compressors, heat exchangers, catalysts that are manufactured in the West. And since February 2022, the West has been banned from shipping those parts to Russia. Russia can repair, but more slowly, with substitute parts from China or Iran that don't always fit, with improvised fixes that don't last as long. And so, a strange new reality begins to take shape. Russia still sells crude abroad and still makes money doing it. But Russia can no longer turn enough of that crude into usable fuel to meet its own demand. It's as if a country with warehouses full of wheat suddenly didn't have enough mills to bake bread. On June 1st, 2026, the math of that reality could no longer be hidden. Moscow had to make a choice. Either keep exporting and leave its own military, its own citizens short, or stop the export and let the world see just how tight things had really gotten. Putin chose the second option, but he said nothing. And the silence says everything. Let's look at the facts carefully so we understand where this story comes from, and so no one can accuse me of exaggerating. First, the decree itself. On June 1st, 2026, the Russian government published a decree banning the export of kerosene, that is jet fuel, until the end of November. According to the Moscow Times and the Russian business newspaper RBC, who first reported the decree, this is the first time in modern Russian history that such a ban has been issued. Earlier export restrictions covered gasoline or diesel, never kerosene. Kerosene was considered the flagship of Russia's refining industry, a premium product for the world market. Second, the scale of the damage. According to the latest oil market report from the International Energy Agency, the IEA, Russia's refineries processed only about 4.7 million barrels of crude oil per day in April of 2026. That is the lowest level since December of 2009. 16 years, the IEA has revised its forecast for Russia's refining capacity in 2026 downward by 150,000 barrels per day. The reason, in their own words, Ukraine's strikes have become, and I quote, increasingly effective. Let that point sit for a moment. The IEA is not a Ukrainian agency. It's not a Western propaganda outlet. It's a neutral observer of the global energy market based in Paris, founded after the oil crisis of 1974. When the IEA says something is becoming increasingly effective, that is essentially a technical verdict. Third, which facilities have been affected. Here we have to be careful because damage assessments vary. But the uncontested points are these. The Sanctions refinery operated by Rosneft was completely shut down after multiple drone strikes. It was the sixth major facility to go offline within a single month. Reuters and oil price report, citing analysts, that the strikes are affecting roughly a quarter of Russia's refining capacity, more than 30% of gasoline production, and about 25% of diesel production. These percentages vary across sources, but all of them agree that the damage is structural, not cosmetic. Fourth, the most recent strikes themselves. According to the Institute for the Study of War, which publishes daily situation reports on the night of May 28th into the 29th, the main distillation columns of the Volgograd refinery were damaged. The units are known by their technical designations AVT 1, 3, 5, and 6. In Yaroslavl, a pump station caught fire. The governor of Volgograd Oblast, Andrei Bocharov himself, confirmed damage to fuel and energy infrastructure and to a chemical plant. That is not a Ukrainian report. That is a Russian confirmation. Fifth, the most recent strike. On the night of May 30th into the 31st, the Ukrainian General Staff claimed it had set off a, quote, large fire at the Saratov refinery. The governor of Saratov Oblast, Roman Busargin, confirmed damage, but only spoke of civilian infrastructure. The independent Russian outlet Astra reported a fire at the refinery itself. Al Jazeera summarized the strikes of that same night and called them one of the most coordinated drone campaigns of recent weeks. When you stack these 5 points of fact on top of each other, you don't get a random picture. You get a map that shows someone has been methodically pulling apart a network one facility at a time for months. And in the moment that network finally tears, Moscow has to make a decision it hasn't had to make in decades. Now we come to the point where most explanations stop and the real story begins. Why does this strategy work? Why can't an industrial nation like Russia simply patch the hole and move on? First mechanism, the physics of a refinery. A modern oil refinery is not a machine you can fix the way you fix a car. It's a chain of facilities that have to work together. At the center sits what's called the atmospheric vacuum distillation tower, in industry shorthand, the AVT. It separates crude oil into its components. When that column is damaged, the entire refinery goes down. Not one line, the whole facility. And building a new column or doing a thorough repair of a damaged one takes 6 to 12 months under normal conditions. Under current conditions, it takes longer. What makes things even more complicated, a modern refinery doesn't have one column, it has a whole chain. A unit for light fractions, one for middle distillates, one for heavy. When a strike takes out the central atmospheric column, all the downstream units, the hydrocracker, the reformer, the hydrotreater, become useless. They run empty. It's like cutting the main artery in a body. All the other organs are still there, but the blood doesn't reach them anymore. That's exactly what's happening in Syzran and Saratov and Volgograd. Not a hole in a wall, a paralysis of the entire system. Second mechanism, the sanctions. Here we get to the real lever. Western sanctions, in place since 2022, ban the export of specialized parts catalysts, control systems, and software to Russia's refining industry. Before the war, Russia imported nearly every critical component from the West, from Germany, from the United States, from Italy. Today, Russia can only acquire those parts through workarounds, through China, through Turkey, through Iran. Those workarounds are more expensive. They're slower. And sometimes the substitute parts don't quite fit. That means every hit on a refinery doesn't just hurt once. It hurts every month after, because the repair keeps dragging on. Concrete names help here. The compressors in Russia's largest refineries originally came from Siemens, from General Electric, from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the control systems from Honeywell and Yokogawa, the catalysts from Albemarle and BASF. None of that can be legally acquired by Russia today. Chinese alternatives exist, but they're not specification grade for plants built to Western standards. Iranian technology also exists, but Iran itself is under sanctions and can barely supply its own refineries. The result, Russia has to improvise. And improvised repairs don't last as long as original equipment ones. The refineries coming back online now will go down again in a year, even without new drone strikes. Third mechanism, the economics of the drone. A long-range drone like the Ukrainian Lyuty or Bober models costs somewhere between a few tens of thousands and maybe $100,000 per unit. The exact numbers are a military secret, but the order of magnitude is clear. A refinery costs hundreds of millions of dollars. The Sizran facility alone processed enormous volumes of crude per year before its closure. The value of the fuel it produced ran into the billions. The ratio between cost and damage is so extremely asymmetric that Western analysts have called it one of the highest returns on investment in modern warfare. Ukraine can build 20 of these drones for the price Russia spends on a single repair. And now the other side of the equation. Russia has to shoot these drones down. An effective interceptor missile like a Panzer or an S-400 costs $1 to $3 million per round. Even if Russian air defense shoots down 80% of the Ukrainian drones, Russia loses more money in every engagement than Ukraine spends. It's an inverted pyramid. The more Russia intercepts, the more expensive the defense becomes. The less it intercepts, the more expensive the damage becomes. There's no exit from that asymmetry. Fourth mechanism, the demand of the Russian military. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The Russian army itself is the largest consumer of kerosene in the country. Su-34 bombers, Tu-95 strategic bombers, the entire tactical air force, they all need jet fuel. The Russian Navy, what's left of it, needs diesel. The logistics behind the frontline trucks, fuel trains, generators burn enormous quantities, and unlike a civilian economy, a war can't dial back its demand. You can close a factory, you can't park a bomber fleet. Fifth mechanism, Putin's dilemma. Here we have to be honest for a moment, because an experienced observer would interject right here, but Russia's crude oil revenues are high. Putin has money. That's true. Russia's revenues from crude oil exports actually rose in early 2026 because global oil prices rose. That's an important point we can't gloss over. But money isn't the problem. The problem is that crude has to be refined into usable fuel before it becomes useful. And that's exactly the part being smashed right now. So Putin is facing a choice that was never on any of his strategy session agendas. Either he takes fuel away from Russian citizens, which is politically toxic because Russians remember fuel shortages as the herald of Soviet collapse, or he takes fuel away from the army, which would be militarily catastrophic. Or he stops the export, which is diplomatically humiliating because it shows the fortress has cracks. He chose the third option. It's the smallest of the three wounds, but it's the first one that can no longer be hidden. Sixth mechanism, the entire supply chain. A refinery produces fuel, but the fuel still has to reach the consumer. In Russia, that happens through a complex network of pipelines, fuel trains, and pump stations. This is where the second layer of Ukrainian strategy lives. The fire in Yaroslavl didn't strike a refinery. It struck a pump station. A pump station is an unassuming building, some machinery, some pipes. But when it goes offline, the fuel that's already been refined can no longer be moved on. It piles up in tanks that weren't built for storage. It degrades. It becomes unusable. So the Ukrainian drone campaign isn't just attacking the refineries. It's attacking the entire logistics chain. It's like hitting not just the mills but also the bakeries and the delivery trucks that move the bread. Seventh mechanism. Why this decree isn't a cure. An export ban of just under 6 months sounds like a solution. It isn't. It's a bandage over a wound that's bleeding internally. As long as the refineries aren't fully repaired and under current conditions that won't happen within 6 months, Russia will be facing exactly the same problem after November of 2026, possibly worse. Because the drone campaign isn't going to stop in November. By every indication, it's going to intensify. Now, the hardest part, the forecast. And I'll be straight with you, predictions about authoritarian regimes are notoriously difficult because they're less transparent than democratic systems. But I'm not going to dodge. I'm going to tell you what I'm betting on why, and what evidence would convince me I'm wrong. There are 3 possible scenarios for the next 6 months. Scenario 1, the central federal budget breaks first. Russia loses so much tax revenue from the collapse of refinery exports that the budget caves in. Teachers don't get paid. Pensions arrive late. The oil-funded social programs shrink. This scenario sounds dramatic, but the data currently argues against it. Russia's crude revenues are high. The National Wealth Fund still sits in the 3-digit billions range. The central bank has reserves. Even under severe pressure, Moscow could push through another budget, maybe 2. I consider this scenario possible, but not the most likely within the next half year. Scenario 2. The civilian home front begins to tear. Fuel rations reach regular gas stations. Prices rise quietly at first, then visibly. Farmers in the agricultural regions complain about diesel shortages during harvest season. Taxi drivers in Moscow and St. Petersburg make noise on social media noise that can't easily be censored because it's not political content, it's economic complaint. Lines at gas stations are an image every Russian knows from their parents' stories. It's not just an image, it's a symbol. And that's the moment Putin becomes politically vulnerable. This is where I bet, not because I want to, but because the logic points here. Putin has proven twice in his career that he fears domestic instability more than military setbacks, once after the sinking of the Kursk, once after the Prigozhin mutiny. Both times, he reacted fast. Here, he will have to react again. There's a historical parallel we can't ignore. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of military defeats. It didn't fall because of NATO. It fell because the shelves were empty. Bread, gasoline, consumer goods, when those things started to disappear, trust in the system collapsed faster than any ideological debate. The veterans inside the Kremlin know this. Putin himself lived through it as a young KGB officer in Dresden when the Berlin Wall fell. He knows a fortress is most vulnerable from the inside. That's exactly why he signed the decree to delay the next step of that spiral. But delay is not prevention. Scenario 3, external escalation. Putin decides the pressure at home can only be relieved through a visible victory at the front or through escalation against the West. A second mobilization, an attack on Western infrastructure, pipelines, undersea cables, possibly satellites. In the extreme case, the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. This scenario can't be ruled out, but it's also not the most likely. Putin knows that escalation against the West forces NATO to react as one. So far, he has avoided such steps precisely because he wants to keep the West divided. So here's what I'm betting on. Scenario 2. The civilian home front breaks first, within the next 90 to 120 days. It doesn't have to be an uprising. It just takes a local fuel crisis in one major Russian city line's price hikes, anger on social networks. That would be the first crack in the facade. Let me get concrete. Watch 3 specific indicators in the coming weeks. First, Krasnodar Krai in southern Russia. It sits closest to the Black Sea coast, and its economy depends on tourism, which depends on air travel. If fuel shortages show up there, it'll show up first. Second, harvest season from July through September. Russian agriculture burns enormous quantities of diesel in those 3 months. If the farmers can't bring in the harvest, food inflation starts. And third, Russian diesel exports. Russia supplies roughly 40% of the global diesel trade. If those exports collapse, prices spike worldwide in Berlin, in London, and Texas. That's the moment this war reaches your wallet. And now, the condition that would convince me I'm wrong, because every honest forecast has to have an exit clause. Here's mine. If fuel prices in Russia's major cities stay stable over the next 90 days, if gas stations operate normally, if Putin lifts the export ban before the end of November with no visible shortages, then I was wrong. Then Russia has more reserves than I'm assuming. Then the fortress is thicker than it looks. But if I'm right, the first signs won't come in the big headlines. We'll see them in telegram channels, in mayoral statements from the provinces, in sudden price spikes for diesel and gasoline. Watch those small signals. They are the real weather. There's a saying, every strategist knows a fortress doesn't fall because the walls collapse. It falls because what supplies it gets quietly cut off. Russia spent decades building a fortress on oil. Today, that fortress is feeding on itself, not because the West besieged it, but because a small buzzing machine keeps arriving at the right place at the right time again and again. If my prediction holds in the coming months, we'll see small, quiet cracks. Watch for them. If you found this analysis useful, share it with someone who needs to see it and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. And now the question that's bigger than a war. If an empire can no longer fall to foreign armies but only to its own logistics, what does that say about how we understand power in the 21st century? What do you think?